it's Christina from Our Wood Home. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my 2024 vegetable garden harvest. I always weigh the things that I pick from the garden just so that I can see everything that I've harvested and contrast or compare that to what I planted and also what I was able to preserve. And then I can look at all that data and see if we need to grow more or less of something the following season. Yes, it's a lot of work, but it has definitely been worth it for me. Previously, I shared everything that I canned in 2024, so now I'll be going through my list of everything that I harvested. Of course, there are some things that I picked from the gardens that didn't necessarily get weighed, so I obviously don't have that information. So I take this kind of just as a ballpark. First, I'll tell you everything that I planted and harvested, and then I'll go in with the actual numbers. I did a few different varieties of tomatoes, some green bell pepper, yellow sweet corn, potatoes, beans, popcorn, a variety of corn, which was interesting. I accidentally grew white pumpkins. I did some eggplants and some hot peppers. I also had some mouse melon is what they're called. They're tiny little green, they're not melons, but they kind of look like little miniature watermelons. They're very cute. I didn't record any quantities of that because we kind of just picked them and snacked on them as we wanted. But we had, I think, 2 plants and it produced really, really well. So I'm thinking of doing that again this spring, but the plants just kind of took over the space they were growing in, so I think I'll do it in a pot this year just to contain it a little bit. I also didn't record the weight or quantity of herbs that I picked because I just didn't want to, and I know that I grow plenty of herbs. I did have some lettuce growing last year, but it didn't really do very well. And I don't think we were able to eat very much of it. Most of it went to chickens because it just wasn't looking great. Let me get into the quantities of everything that I was able to harvest. First, tomatoes. I did 128.5 pounds of ripe red tomatoes. I also got 6.4 pounds of green tomatoes. It's really a shock because I wasn't expecting that many, but I'm very glad that it did well. My beets, on the other hand, did not do very well. I did 1.8 pounds of beets. I also just realized I didn't write down the quantity of carrots that I picked, and I only remembered that because they were growing right next to the beets. But the carrots did not do very well at all. I think I maybe got 5 or 6 carrots. The green bell pepper, some of them ended up turning into red peppers, which I didn't know would happen. I just assumed red bell peppers were their own specific type of plant. So that was fun to learn. I did 13 green bell peppers. Well, bell peppers, some of them were red. For the yellow corn, I got 50 cobs of corn, which sounds like a lot, but they were pretty tiny cobs. I think I talked about this in my preserving video from 2024. The corn just didn't do very well, so even though I got a large quantity of cobs, it wasn't a large volume of kernels, if that makes sense. The potatoes totaled 28 pounds, which was kind of a surprise because I wasn't really planning to do potatoes, but I found some in my basement that were sprouting, so I planted them. I did beans, and I got 5 pounds of beans. I would have liked to have done more beans, but I was kind of just working with a finite amount of space because we decided to let one of our main large vegetable garden plots rest all last year, so I was down about 200 square feet of space. So I was really just trying to maximize the space that I was able to use to try to get a lot of things that we primarily wanted to eat, and the beans were just not a top priority. I ended up with 32 cobs of popping corn. It's a pink variety that you can use to make popcorn. We actually haven't tried popping any yet, so I definitely need to try it to see if it's worth growing, and then I can adjust my quantities for this coming season. The white pumpkins were not planned. I had pumpkins growing in that general area the previous year, but they didn't really get to a good size because of pests, so I didn't even think any of the seeds stayed in the soil, but apparently it did, and this plant ended up growing from a spot that I didn't even have pumpkins planted. So I just decided to leave it, and I got 22 little mini pumpkins. I know those pumpkins can be eaten, or they can also be used as decor. I didn't really know what to do with them. I ended up selling them to somebody else who was looking for pumpkins for centerpieces for her wedding, so that was kind of neat. The eggplant was an experiment. I now know I don't like eggplant as a thing to eat. I ended up with 9 eggplant, and that was just from, I think, 2 or 3 plants. I can't remember exactly how many off the top of my head, but I don't think I'll be planting as much eggplant this year, maybe just 1 plant, because it just wasn't something we were eating a lot of. I got 15 hot peppers. I can't remember what variety it was, but they did pretty well. I definitely could have got more if I planted the seeds earlier. I don't really know what happened exactly, but I ended up with a surprise hot pepper plant just growing in a place that I thought I sowed some flower seeds. So I remember sowing them a little bit later than I usually do, and I just found a pepper plant growing in there. So if I had planted it earlier, I think I would have had a better harvest, but 15 is still pretty good. I'm also just checking my notes again, and I'm realizing I did plant a few other things that I just didn't record quantities for. I tried planting zucchini. I think I maybe got 1 or 2 zucchini from those plants because I deal with pests here that go right for any type of cucumber or gourd plant. So I was trying to avoid that pest pressure last summer by doing the seeds a little bit later in the season to see if that would help. It did not, but thankfully a very kind neighbor of mine offered me a ton of zucchini from her garden, so I did not go without zucchini. I also planted some peas, and those didn't do very well either, and I just didn't record any quantities of those. And I planted radish for the first time, which actually did really well. We had a ton of radishes coming in, and it was very early in the season, so I wasn't recording, but we got a ton of radishes, which was very exciting. That's everything that I recorded that I harvested from my gardens. I typically have 2 different types of gardens, a harvest vegetable garden and a preserving vegetable garden. If you've seen my garden tour and garden update videos throughout the years, you might already know that. But basically, I dedicated one whole section of my garden to being a preserving garden. So everything that we grow there is for the purpose of being preserved in some form later, whether that's canning, freezing, dehydrating, or freeze drying. I started doing this because I was really wanting to can a lot of vegetables from my garden, and my husband pointed out that maybe it would be nice to actually get to eat some fresh during the season. So we now have a preserving garden and a harvest garden, and everything that's grown in the harvest garden, we can just eat it as it's ready. It doesn't need to be set aside for preserving for later use. If we end up with a surplus of things from the harvest garden, we'll just go ahead and preserve those. And with the tomatoes this past year, because we had so many plants producing so many tomatoes, we were just eating as much as we were able to fresh and just canning everything else. I actually had a few tomato plants growing on our deck just outside our dining room. So anytime we wanted some for a salad or any other purpose that was fresh, we'd just go out and pick a handful, and that worked out really nicely. I know I ended up with way more tomatoes than what I actually recorded, but later in the summer I invited my stepmom and young stepsisters to come over and help me pick some tomatoes and some mouse melon, and I think maybe they got some corn too, but I can't remember. I just had way too many tomatoes and their plants weren't doing all that great, so I invited them to come over and fill a few baskets to take home with them. And I did not record the quantity that they picked, but I estimate it was maybe 3 to 5 pounds worth of tomatoes, but I just didn't include that in my list. I haven't really started planning my 2025 gardens yet, which may sound like a shock, but I pretty much plant the same things every single year, so I know what I'm going to be needing space for, and I do some rotation in my gardens, but generally I keep things sort of in the same area. So I do need to sit down and just decide if I need to grow more or less of something and where I'm going to put it so that I can start making a plan for any soil amendments. The only seeds that I really start indoors are tomatoes and peppers. Last year I did start a few flowers indoors because they were new and I'm not really familiar with growing flowers from seeds, so I wanted to give them their best chance. I think I might also do the eggplant indoors. That's everything I wanted to share with you today in this video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos about gardening and preserving if that's something that you're interested in. And if you like what you see and you are not already subscribed, I hope that you consider subscribing. Again, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.